the sharp, metallic clack of a Winchester repeating rifle lever echoing through the humid Oklahoma night was the only warning Bill Doolin ever received. There were no grand speeches, no honorable challenges shouted across a dusty street, and absolutely no hesitation from the men hiding in the darkness. This was the brutal, unforgiving reality of a frontier manhunt in the late 19th century, a world where the romanticized myths of outlaw brotherhood were violently shattered by the cold, calculated mechanics of federal law enforcement. We are tearing open the files on the most relentless, tactically perfect manhunts in the history of the American West, starting with a man who built an empire of stolen wealth only to be systematically hunted down like a feral animal. Before we dive into the dirt, the blood, and the ballistics of this legendary pursuit, I need to know who is riding alongside us on this trail, so drop your exact city in the comments right now to map out our global squad of truth seekers who demand real history over Hollywood fairy tales. Our first target is William Doolin, a man who did not start his life as a cold-blooded killer or a desperate thief. Born in Arkansas in 1858, Doolin was the son of a hard-working farmer, a restless kid who eventually drifted west searching for honest work and a quiet purpose on the open frontier. By the time he was 23, he had secured a stable, respected position as a cowboy at the HX Bar Ranch in the Indian Territory. The ranch owner, Oscar Halsell, saw genuine potential in the young man, taking the time to teach Doolin how to read, write, and handle basic arithmetic. Doolin was smart, capable, and trusted, eventually earning the position of informal foreman. For nearly a decade, he built a stellar reputation across the region as a reliable and highly skilled ranch hand. He learned the land, mapping the hidden canyons, the shallow river crossings, and the dense brush of the territory in his mind, inadvertently building the geographic database that would later save his life countless times. But the frontier is a corrosive environment, and honest wages of $30 a month felt like a cruel joke when compared to the literal mountains of gold and federal cash flowing through the armored safes of the railroads. The 1890s were a transitional era. The wild, open plains were being carved up by steel rails and telegraph wires, and the men who worked the cattle felt the suffocating grip of industrialization closing in around them. During his grueling years on the sprawling ranches, Doolin crossed paths with a dangerous breed of men, hardened drifters who would eventually become the most infamous outlaws of their generation. He rode alongside figures like Bitter Creek Newcomb, Dynamite Dick Clifton, and the remnants of the decimated Dalton family. The transition from a trusted foreman to an apex predator was not an overnight snap, but a slow, calculated pivot fueled by ambition and the intoxicating realization that his organizational skills could easily be weaponized for massive financial gain. Doolin understood that most outlaw gangs failed because they were disorganized mobs of impulsive drunks who relied on blind luck rather than strategy. When he finally abandoned the honest life and formed his own syndicate, famously known as the Wild Bunch, he ran it with the rigid, unforgiving discipline of a paramilitary unit. They targeted trains and banks across Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, utilizing synchronized cavalry assaults, pre-planned escape routes with fresh relay horses, and superior repeating firepower to completely overwhelm local authorities. When they hit a train, it was a masterclass in kinetic shock and awe. The gang would grease the tracks on a steep incline or pile heavy timber across the rails, forcing the massive, steam-breathing iron behemoth to screech to a violent, sparking halt in the middle of nowhere. Doolin would board the locomotive through the blinding steam, put a cold revolver to the engineer's head, and completely paralyze the train's crew. If the express messenger refused to open the heavy steel safe, Doolin did not negotiate. He simply applied raw, explosive physics, utilizing stolen dynamite to violently blow the heavy iron doors completely off their hinges, grabbing the canvas sacks of currency, and vanishing into the night. Doolin was a master of terrain exploitation, using the rugged, unmapped wilderness of the Indian Territory as a natural fortress. He knew exactly where the jurisdictional lines were drawn, stepping across county borders to render pursuing sheriffs legally impotent, effectively becoming a ghost before posses could even saddle their horses. But every successful strike, every blown safe, and every stolen dollar only increased the massive bounty on his head, eventually drawing the attention of a completely different breed of lawman. Enter Deputy United States Marshal Heck Thomas, a veteran, battle-hardened manhunter who did not play by the conventional, slow-moving rules of frontier justice. Thomas was a relentless, analytical predator who viewed the pursuit of Bill Doolin not as a standard law enforcement job, but as a complex mathematical equation that required a definitive, highly lethal solution. While local sheriffs rode out blindly into the brush and exhausted their horses chasing rumors, Thomas weaponized the very industrialization that Doolin was fighting against. The marshal utilized the sprawling telegraph network to instantly track the gang's movements, cultivated a vast web of paid informants hidden within the criminal underworld, and analyzed Doolin's logistical supply lines, slowly and methodically tightening the noose around the wild bunch. The intense, suffocating psychological pressure of this relentless hunt eventually cracked the gang's discipline, leading to Doolin's dramatic capture and his subsequent imprisonment in the federal jail at Guthrie. For a brief moment, it seemed the brilliant outlaw had finally been neutralized. However, a man completely accustomed to the absolute freedom of the plains cannot be contained by simple iron bars and incompetent guards. On the 5th of July, 1896, Doolin and 13 other desperate inmates executed a flawless, violently coordinated jailbreak. They did not just pick a lock, they mapped the guard patrols, weaponized the blind spots of the facility, and struck with synchronized precision. They overpowered the guards, seized their weapons, and scattered across the Oklahoma Territory like a handful of thrown gravel, completely humiliating the federal authorities and leaving the warden staring at an empty cell block. Doolin made a desperate, highly calculated run for Lawson, Oklahoma, seeking temporary refuge with his wife and hoping to gather enough resources to disappear permanently across the border. He believed he had finally outsmarted the system, but he severely underestimated the terrifying patience and cold-blooded determination of Heck Thomas. The marshal did not blindly chase Doolin across the territory in a frantic panic. He anticipated his exact movements, knowing that a desperate man will always return to his foundational roots. Thomas quietly assembled a specialized posse of heavily armed, fiercely dedicated deputies, moving under the cover of darkness to avoid detection by Doolin's local sympathizers. They arrived in Lawson and set a flawless, geometrically perfect tactical ambush on the outskirts of the town, completely surrounding the property where Doolin was hiding. On the humid, suffocating night of August 24th, Doolin cautiously walked out into the darkness to check his horses, completely blind to the lethal perimeter of federal rifles aimed directly at his chest. When Thomas finally broke the silence and ordered him to surrender, Doolin's deeply ingrained combat reflexes instantly took over. He did not raise his hands in defeat. He immediately reached for his Winchester rifle, choosing a violent, kinetic resolution over a return to the suffocating confines of an iron cage. In that microscopic fraction of a second, the darkness violently erupted. Heck Thomas, refusing to take any chances with a man known for his blinding speed, leveled a massive 10-gauge shotgun loaded with heavy buckshot and squeezed the trigger. The physics of the encounter were absolute, uncompromising, and instantly fatal. The massive payload of heavy lead tore through the night air at hundreds of feet per second, violently impacting Doolin's chest and instantly shattering his skeletal structure. The sheer kinetic energy physically lifted the notorious outlaw off his feet, devastating his internal organs and dropping him entirely dead into the Oklahoma dirt before his fingers could even rack the lever of his rifle. The sound of the shotgun blast rolled across the plains like a crack of thunder, erasing Doolin with an industrial brutality that completely ignored his legendary status. There was no grand, poetic monologue, no heroic last stand against overwhelming odds, just the deafening roar of black powder and the sudden, brutal termination of a human life. The government was taking absolutely no chances with his legacy. Doolin's bullet-riddled body was transported back to Guthrie and placed on public display, a grim, undeniable warning to anyone who believed they could outrun the mechanical efficiency of federal justice. Local photographers captured morbid images of the deceased outlaw, which were later sold to a fascinated public along with a memorial poem written by Doolin's widow. The proceeds were meant to cover his burial costs, highlighting the impoverished reality that often followed a life of high-stakes robbery. The government ultimately paid for the embalming, burying him in the Boot Hill section of Summit View Cemetery, permanently closing the book on an honest, hard-working cowboy who weaponized his own intellect to build a massive criminal empire, only to be mathematically dismantled by a lawman who understood that the ultimate currency on the frontier was never gold, but rather unyielding patience and high-velocity lead. The air inside the Florida train car was thick with cigar smoke and the suffocating tension of a cornered predator. John Wesley Hardin, a man who boasted a kill count of 42 men, sat near the window with his hand resting inches from a hidden revolver. He thought he had vanished. He thought putting 1,000 miles between himself and the Texas border had erased his blood-soaked ledger. He was completely wrong. Hardin was not a tactical bank robber or a calculating syndicate leader. He was a well-educated preacher's son whose absolute disregard for human life defied all logic. He killed his first man at 15 and once famously shot a stranger through a hotel wall simply because the man was snoring too loudly. He viewed murder as a casual inconvenience. But his fatal mistake occurred in 1874 when he gunned down Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb in the streets of Comanche, Texas. You do not execute a Texas lawman and expect the state to just let it go. The government unleashed the newly formed Frontier Battalion of the Texas Rangers to hunt him down, specifically tasking a man named John Barkley Armstrong with the impossible job. They called Armstrong Mac Nellius Bulldog for a reason. He was a relentless tracker who did not care about jurisdictional boundaries, bureaucratic red tape, or the terrifying reputation of his target. Armstrong picked up Hardin's cold trail in Texas and stalked him like a phantom. He followed the whispers, the fake aliases, and the scattered telegraph reports across the Deep South, cutting through the swamps of Alabama and tracking the fugitive directly to a train pulling into Pensacola. Armstrong was actually recovering from a severe gunshot wound at the time. He was walking with a heavy wooden cane, practically dragging his leg. But when he boarded that passenger car and locked eyes with the most prolific killer in the West, the pain vanished. Hardin recognized the lawman instantly. The outlaw's survival instincts flared, and he immediately lunged for his concealed weapon, fully prepared to add another badge to his terrifying resume. Armstrong did not flinch. He drew his heavy Colt revolver, but instead of firing a blind shot into a crowded train car and risking civilian lives, he used the weapon as a brutal blunt instrument. Before Hardin's gun could even clear leather, Armstrong closed the gap and brought the solid iron barrel crashing down onto Hardin's skull. The blow was devastating. It shattered the outlaw's consciousness and dropped him to the floorboards in an instant. Armstrong did not just arrest the most feared gunfighter in America. He shackled him, tossed him into a baggage car, and personally dragged him all the way back to Texas to face the gallows. Hardin miraculously escaped the noose but spent the next 15 years rotting in a Huntsville prison cell. The myth of the untouchable, lightning-fast gunslinger was completely dismantled by a single, crippled ranger who proved that a fast draw means absolutely nothing against a man who simply refuses to stop hunting you. The telegraph wires across the Pacific Northwest were practically melting from the sheer volume of panic being transmitted. It was the summer of 1902, and the entire region had been completely paralyzed by a single, heavily armed fugitive who simply refused to die. This was not a coordinated gang of train robbers or a massive criminal syndicate. It was one man, bleeding, exhausted, and leaving a trail of dead lawmen across 2 states. We are opening the file on Harry Tracy, the last true desperado of the American West, and the subject of the most desperate, chaotic, and heavily publicized manhunt in modern history. Tracy was a hardened killer serving a 50-year sentence in the Oregon State Penitentiary. The prison authorities thought they had him permanently caged. They were wrong. On a quiet June morning, Tracy and his cellmate, David Merrill, acquired 2 smuggled Winchester rifles. They did not try to sneak out in the shadows. They initiated a full-scale war inside the prison walls. Tracy gunned down 3 guards in cold blood, hijacked a civilian delivery wagon, and smashed through the heavy wooden gates into the surrounding woods. What followed was a 2-month masterclass in survival, violence, and evasion. The state mobilized absolutely everything they had. Sheriffs formed massive posses. The governor called in the state militia. They even deployed coastal artillery units and packs of specialized bloodhounds to track him through the dense, unforgiving Oregon timber. Tracy did not care. When the bloodhounds got too close, he did not panic. He simply turned around, waited in the brush, and shot the dogs dead. When the posses cornered him near the Columbia River, he did not surrender. He commandeered a civilian steamboat, placed his rifle against the captor's head, and forced the terrified crew to navigate him straight down the river, completely bypassing the massive dragnet waiting on the roads. He was fighting a one-man guerrilla war against the 20th century. He lived off the land, stole fresh horses at gunpoint, and engaged in half a dozen brutal firefights, slipping through the fingers of the law again and again. But the sheer mathematics of exhaustion eventually catch up to every running man. By early August, Tracy was pushed deep into the dry, unforgiving wheat fields of eastern Washington. He was starving, sleep-deprived, and running out of ammunition. A heavily armed posse finally cornered him on a remote ranch near the town of Creston. They did not try to read him his rights or negotiate an arrest. They simply opened fire from a distance. A heavy lead bullet tore through Tracy's right leg, severing a major artery and completely destroying his mobility. He managed to drag his bleeding body into the center of a dense wheat field, clutching his Winchester. The posse, terrified of his reputation and knowing what he was capable of in close quarters, refused to go into the brush after him. They just surrounded the field and waited for the sun to go down. As the darkness settled over the Washington plains, Harry Tracy realized that the impossible physics of his escape had finally dropped to zero. There were no more stolen horses, no more hijacked boats, and absolutely no way out of the crossfire. But he refused to give the state the satisfaction of a public hanging. The posse heard a single, muffled gunshot echo from the center of the wheat field. When they cautiously approached the next morning, they found the most dangerous man in the West lying dead in the dirt, having used his final bullet to end the chase on his own terms. The legendary manhunt was over. Tracy's death marked the definitive, bloody end of the Wild West era, proving that the untamed outlaws of the 19th century simply could not survive the organized, industrialized law enforcement of the modern world. We are fighting a daily war against a digital machine that wants to sanitize these brutal truths. The algorithms want to bury the dirt, the blood, and the gunpowder of our history, feeding you a polished, fake version of reality. But we refuse to let the true stories of survival and frontier justice fade into the void. We are the keepers of the flame. If you made it to the end of this blood-stained trail, I need you to go down into the comments right now, look the system in the eye, and type, "We hold the line."